Hello, this is Philip Chen, and we are reading the book A Swim in a Pond in the Rain. We've finished off the short story, the Russian short story, The Singers by Ivan Turgenev, and we are now going to hear from the author, George Saunders, about his afterthoughts. So, as George writes, in this book, we're discussing what the Russians did, but we're not going to be able to say much, I expect, about exactly how they did it. They weren't as fond as interviews and craft talks and process related discussions as we are. In his exhaustive biography of Chekhov, we learn that Chekhov wrote it in Nice at a hotel desk in a room on the second floor in a period of a few months during which he also wrote two other stories, The Pecheneg and The Homecoming. But that's all we know about the circumstances of its creation, other than that it's writing it in a hotel felt to Chekhov, as he put it, like sewing on someone else's machine. In Troyat's biography of Turgenev, The Singers isn't mentioned at all. But really, it doesn't matter. We know that no matter how the Russians did it, we're each going to have to find our own way. So I thought here I'd talk a little bit about the only process with which I'm really familiar, mine, just to underscore the idea that discussing a short story in technical terms, as we're doing here, doesn't fully unlock the mystery of how a story actually gets written. We often discuss art this way. The artist had something he wanted to express, and then he just, expressed it. That is, we buy into some version of the intentional fallacy, the notion that art is about having a clear-cut intention and then confidently executing the same. The actual process, in my experience, is much more mysterious and beautiful and much more of a pain in the ass to discuss truthfully. A guy, Stan, constructs a model railroad town in his basement. Stan acquires a small hobo, places him under a plastic railroad bridge near that fake campfire, then notices that he's arranged his hobo into a certain posture. The hobo seems to be gazing back at the town. Why is he looking over there? At that little blue Victorian house. Stan notes a plastic woman in the window, then turns her a little so she's gazing out. Over at the railroad bridge, actually. Suddenly, Stan has made a love story. Oh, why can't they be together? If only little Jack would just go home to his wife, to Linda. What did Stan, the artist, just do? Well, first, surveying his little domain, he noticed which way his hobo was looking. Then he chose to change that little universe by turning the plastic woman. Now, Stan didn't exactly decide to turn her. It might be more accurate to say that it occurred to him to do so in a split second with no accompanying language, except maybe a very quite internal yes. He just liked it better that way for reasons he couldn't articulate, and before he'd had the time or inclination to articulate them. In my view, all art begins in that instant of intuitive preference. How then to proceed? Skipping over for the moment the first draft, assuming some existing text to work with, my method is this. I imagine a meter mounted in my forehead with a P on this side, positive, and an N on that side, negative. I try to read what I've written the way a first-time reader might, without hope and without despair. Where's the needle? If it drops into the N zone, admit it, and then instantly a fix might present itself, a cut, a rearrangement, an addition. There's not an intellectual or analytical component to this. It's more of an impulse, one that results in a feeling of, yes, that's better. It's akin to that hobo adjustment, above, by instinct, in that moment. And really, that's about it. I go through the draft like that, marking it up, and then back and enter that round of changes, print it out, read it again for as long as I still feel sharp, usually 3 or 4 times in a writing day. So, a repetitive, obsessive, iterative application of preference. Watch the needle, adjust the prose, watch the needle, adjust the prose, lather, rinse, repeat. Through, sometimes, hundreds of drafts over months or even years. Over time, like a cruise ship slowly turning, the story will start to alter course via those thousands of incremental adjustments. Early in a story, I'll have a few discrete blocks, blobs, swaths of loose, sloppy text. As I revise those blocks, will start to get better. Soon a block will start working. I can get all the way through it without a needle drop. The word that sometimes comes to mind is undeniable, as in, all right, this bit is pretty much undeniable, which means that I feel that any responsible reader would like it and would still be with me at the end of it. A block, revised, starts telling me what it's for. Sometimes it asks a question. Who is this Craig of whom they are speaking? Or seems to want to cause something to happen. Fern has offended Bryce and he's about to blow. Once I have a few undeniable blocks of text, they start telling me what order they'd like to be in, and sometimes one will say that I really ought to cut it out entirely. If you get rid of me, block B, then blocks A and C will abut, and look at that, that's good, right. I start asking questions. Does E cause F or does F cause E? Which feels more natural? Which makes more sense? Which produces a more satisfying click? Then certain blocks start to adhere. E must precede F, and I know they won't come unstuck. When something has achieved undeniability, it feels like something that has actually happened and can't be undone instead of just words on a page. As the blocks start to fall into order, the resulting feeling of causation starts to mean something. If a man puts his fist through a wall, then joins a street protest, that's one story. If he comes home from a street protest and puts his fist through the wall, that's another, and starts to suggest what the story might want to be about. Although part of this process is to shake off that feeling as much as possible and keep returning to that P/N meter, trusting that those big thematic decisions are going to be made naturally by way of thousands of accreting micro decisions at the line level. But all of this at every step is more felt than decided. When I'm writing well, there's almost no intellectual/analytical thinking going on. When I first found this method, it felt so freeing. I didn't have to worry, didn't have to decide. I just had to be there as I read my story fresh each time, watching that meter, willing to playfully make changes at the line level, knowing that if I was wrong, I'd get a chance to change it back on the next read. I once heard someone say that given infinite time, anything can happen. That's how this way of revising makes me feel. No need for overarching decisions. The story has a will of its own. Once it is trying to make me feel, and if I just trust that it all will be well, the story will suppress my initial vision of it. I once heard the great Chicago writer Stuart Dybek say, "A story is always talking to you. You just have to learn to listen to it." Revising like this is a way of listening to the story and having faith in it. It wants to be its best self, and if you're patient with it, in time it will be. Essentially, the whole process is intuition plus iteration. Why iteration? Let's say I gave you an apartment in New York City, one that I decorated. That would be nice of me, but it might feel a little impersonal since I don't know you. Say that I then allowed you to redecorate it at my expense in one day. The result would be much more like you than my initial attempt, but it would still be limited by the fact that I gave you only one day in which to do it. The result would reflect, we might say, only one of the many possible people that you are. Now let's say, instead, I let you take out one item a day. Today the couch, tomorrow the clock, the next day that ugly little throw rug, and replace it with an item of equal value of your choice. And I let you do that for, say, the next 2 years. By the end of that 2 years, that apartment will have more you in it than either of us could have imagined at the outset. It will have had the benefit of the opinions of literally hundreds of manifestations of you happy, you grouchy, you stern, you euphoric, you blurry, you precise, and so on. Your intuition will have been given thousands of chances to do its best work. That's how I see revision, a chance for the writer's intuition to assert itself over and over. A piece written and revised in this way, like one of those seed crystals in biology class, starts out small and devoid of intention and begins to expand organically, reacting to itself, fulfilling its own energy. The beauty of this method is that it doesn't really matter what you start with or how the initial data gets generated. What makes you, you as a writer, is what you do to any old text by way of this iterative method. This method overturns the tyranny of the first draft. Who cares if the first draft is good? It doesn't need to be good, it just needs to be so you can revise it. You don't need an idea to start a story, you just need a sentence. Where does that sentence come from? Wherever. It doesn't need to be anything special. It will become something special over time as you keep reacting to it. Reacting to that sentence and changing it, hoping to divest it of some of its ordinariness or sloth, is writing. That's all writing is or needs to be. We'll find our voice and ethos and distinguish ourselves from all the other writers in the world without needing to make any big overarching decisions, just by the thousands of small ones we make as we revise. When our daughters were small, I'd sometimes dump a bunch of building toys on the floor, Legos and wooden blocks and parts of other sets, and we'd sit there for hours, listening to music and talking and absent-mindedly making something. There was no plan. We were just putting this with that because we liked the way it looked. But pretty soon a structure would start to appear. These ramps were leading to that platform, and there was a cool little space under that platform. An excellent place for that plastic dragon and Lego plumber to live. The final product was complex, and I think you could say it had meaning. But it wasn't a meaning we'd intentionally put there. No way could we have planned out something so strange or anticipated the exact effect it would have had on us later then. Having forgotten we'd made it, we walked past it. That is, the thing we would have planned would have been less. The best it could have been was exactly what we intended it to be, but a work of art has to do more than that. It has to surprise its audience, what it can do only if it isn't legitimately surprised its creator. What's interesting to me is that revising by this method, trying to make better sentences per one's taste over and over, has unintended effects, ones that we might characterize as moral ethical. When I write, Bob was an asshole, and then feeling this sentence to be somewhat lacking in specificity, revised it to read, Bob snapped impatiently at the barista. Then ask myself, seeing yet more specificity, why Bob might have done that, and revised to, Bob snapped impatiently at the young barista who reminded him of his dead wife. Then paused to add, who he missed so much, especially now at Christmas. In the process, Bob has gone from pure asshole to grieving widower, so overcome with grief that he has behaved ungraciously to a young person to whom normally he would have been nice. Bob started out a cartoon on which I could heap some scorn, so that my reader and I could be united in looking down at Bob, but now he's closer to us in a different life. So we might say that text has become more alert to Bob. But that didn't happen because I was trying to be a good guy. It happened because I was discontented with the sentence, Bob was an asshole, and tried to make it better. But the person who wrote, Bob snapped impatiently at the young barista who reminded him of his dead wife, Marie, who he missed so much, especially now at Christmas, which had always been her favorite time of the year, feels like a better guy somehow than the one who wrote, Bob was an asshole. I find this happening all the time. I like the person I am in my stories better than I like the real me. The person is smarter, wittier, more patient, funnier. His view of the world is wiser. When I stop writing and come back to myself, I feel more limited, opinionated, and petty. What a pleasure it was to have been, on the page, briefly less of a dope than usual. So, what does an artist do, mostly? She tweaks that which has already been done. There are these moments when we sit before a blank page, but mostly we're adjusting. That's what's already been there. The writer revises, the painter touches up, the director edits, the musician overdubs. I write. Jane came into the room and sat down on the blue couch. I read that, wince, cross out, came into the room. Why does she have to come into the room? And down. Can someone sit up on a couch? And blue, why do we care if it's blue? And that sentence has now become Jane sat on the couch. Suddenly, it's better. Hemingway-esque even. Although, why is it meaningful for Jane to sit on a couch? Do we really need that? So we sat on the couch, and we are simply left Jane, which at least doesn't suck and has the virtue of brevity. This is, of course, a bit of a joke, but it's also deadly serious. By reducing the sentence to Jane, we've preserved our hope of being original. We've averted mediocrity. The whole world of excellence still lies before us. But it's interesting, why did we make those cuts? Well, we might say that we made them out of respect for our reader. By asking that series of questions, why is it meaningful for Jane to sit on a couch, and so on, we are serving as a sort of advanced man for our reader. We are assuming to be a smart person of good taste, a person we wouldn't want to bore. Consider this passage. Entering the restaurant, Jim saw his ex-wife, Sarah, sitting closely beside a man who looked to be at least 20 years younger than her. Jim couldn't believe it. It was too shocking to see Sarah with someone so much younger than her, younger than Jim too, since he and Sarah were the same age. So shocking that Jim dropped his car keys. "Sir," the waiter said, "you dropped these," and handed Jim his car keys. You may have noted your needle dipping into the end zone in there somewhere, maybe a couple times, a dip and then a sub-dip. Now consider the edited version. Entering the restaurant, Jim saw his ex-wife, Sarah, sitting beside a man who looked to be at least 20 years younger than her. "Sir," the waiter said, "you dropped these," and handed Jim his car keys. So what just happened? Well, I cut. Jim couldn't believe it. It was so shocking to see Sarah with someone so much younger than her, younger than Jim too, since he and Sarah were the same age. So shocking that Jim dropped his car keys. The difference in the two versions is that the latter version has more respect for you, the reader, built into it. The ideas Jim couldn't believe it and it was shocking are contained in the action of Jim dropping his keys. I made the leap of faith that you'd assume Jim and Sarah to be about the same age. In the process, I saved myself and you 37 words, about half the total length of the original bit. How did I go about making the cut? Well, I imagined that I was you and that you read the same way I do, that you'd be discontented with the first version at the same places I was as I read it. The story is a frank, intimate conversation between equals. We keep reading because we continue to feel respected by the writer. We feel her over there on the production end of the process, imagining that we are as intelligent and worldly and curious as she is, because she's paying attention to where we are and where to put us. She knows when we are expecting a change or feeling skeptical of this new development or getting tired of this episode. She also knows that when she's delighted us and that in that state we're slightly more open to whatever she'll do next. This story of an idea as an ongoing communication between two minds arises naturally from the activity of one person telling a story to another. The model applies to these Russian stories we're reading and would have applied the first time some cave people gathered around a fire for their first literary reading. And if that early storyteller ignored this notion of story as ongoing communication between performer and audience, he would have found, as today, that some of his audience was dozing off or sneaking out of the cave entirely, in that crouching posture people adopt when sneaking out of a literary event, as if crouching like that will make them invisible to the author, which, believe me, it doesn't. The exciting part of all this to me is that we always have a basis on which to proceed. The reader is out there and she's real. She's interested in life, and by picking up our work has given us the benefit of the doubt. All we have to do is engage her. To engage her, all we have to do is value her. So there you have it. We have finished The Singers by Ivan Turgenev, and we are now on to, coming up soon next, the next story, The Darling, by, once again, Anton Chekhov. This is Philip Chen, and we are magical.